Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time, and if it is your first time, don't forget to hit like, subscribe and tap that notification bell. It really does help the channel grow. Today we're tackling a question that's been quietly hanging over Pink Floyd fandom for years. Will Roger Waters ever release a box set devoted to the final cut? And perhaps more importantly, do we actually need one?
Plans to build a nuclear fallout shelter at Peterborough and Cambridge.
3 High Court judges have cleared...
Released in 1983, the final cut remains one of the most divisive albums in the Pink Floyd catalogue. For some, it's a forgotten masterpiece, a bleak, emotionally raw mediation of war, loss and political betrayal. For others, it barely qualifies as a Pink Floyd album at all. More a Roger Waters solo effort in all but name. It's the only Floyd album without Richard Wright. It's dominated by Waters' lyrics, voice and worldview. And yet it also contains some of David Gilmour's most expressive guitar work in my opinion, particularly that searing solo on the Fletcher Memorial Home. Subtitled A Requiem for the Post-War Dream, it feels less like a band album and more like a closing statement. In many ways, it's Roger Waters saying goodbye, not just to Pink Floyd, but to the ideals he felt his father's generation had died for. I had previously done a shootout video on the final cut, featuring these 3 different versions of the album. An original first pressing from 1983, a Japanese pressing, and the later Bernie Grumman mastering from 2004, 2002, rings a bell. But anyway, so why talk about a final cut box at all? Almost every other era of Pink Floyd has been thoroughly documented and repackaged. We've had the early years, the later years, the Animals remix, the anniversary editions of Dark Side, The Wall, and now, recently, Wish You Were Here. But the final cut has largely been left behind. Yes, it was remastered in 2004, as I said earlier, but I'll be honest, I've never been a fan of that version, and if you've seen my shootout video, you'll know why. The biggest issue for me is the decision to shoehorn When the Tigers Broke Free into the album's running order. To understand why that bothers me, it's worth revisiting the song's history. When the Tigers Broke Free was written at the same time as The Wall, which is why its copyright date is 1979. It was originally intended to be part of The Wall, but was rejected by the other members of the band on the grounds that it was simply too personal. The song was later recorded and released as a standalone 7-inch single on the 26th of July 1982. With a running time of exactly 3 minutes, and it subsequently appeared in the film version of The Wall. Interestingly, that original single was labelled Taken from the album The Final Cut, even though the song was not actually included on the album when it was released in 1983. It wouldn't appear on the final cut at all until the 2004 remaster, and for me, all of that history only reinforces one thing. It highlights that When the Tigers Broke Free being added to the final cut was ultimately an afterthought. It wasn't conceived as part of the album, it wasn't sequenced as part of the album, and it doesn't meaningfully add anything to the final cut's narrative. The album already says exactly what it needs to say about the war, loss and disillusionment, and it does so with a very deliberate emotional arc. Now, don't get me wrong, Tigers is a powerful song, no question, but its power comes from its specificity, from being a standalone piece rooted in Waters' personal history. Dropping it into the final cut doesn't deepen the album's story, it simply, in my opinion, interrupts it. That's why if a box set were ever to happen, I'd want the album presented as it was originally released. The ideal solution would be to include a faithful reproduction of the original 7-inch single, complete with the gatefold sleeve, allowing Tigers to exist in its proper context, whilst preserving the final cut in its intended form. And if we're talking about doing this properly, the original album should be cut from the original master tapes, not a digital file, not a revisionist edit, but an analogue presentation of the final cut as it existed in 1983. Handled that way, a box set wouldn't rewrite history, it would respect it. So why hasn't it happened? Well, the answer, surprisingly, is Roger Waters. The final cut occupies a strange grey area in Floyd lore. It's officially a Pink Floyd album, but creatively and emotionally, it's a Waters record. By 1983, relations within the band had completely collapsed. David Gilmour went so far as to request that his production credit be removed from the album sleeve. Both he and Nick Mason have since described the album sessions as painful, a period where they felt less like band members and more like session musicians. And because of that, it's extremely unlikely either Gilmour or Mason would ever agree to take part in a retrospective documentary on the album. It's simply not an era they would wish to revisit. However, one major thing has changed. Sony Music now owns the rights to the entire Floyd catalogue, and that includes the final cut. Sony has the resources, the infrastructure and the long-term strategy to develop serious archival releases. And crucially, they're far more likely to work with Roger Waters rather than around him, to ensure any release carries real artistic authority. So while nothing is guaranteed, a final cut box set no longer feels unrealistic. It now feels like something that could really happen when Sony and Waters decide the time is right. Storm Thorgerson, co-founder of Hypnosis and designer of most Pink Floyd sleeves, was deliberately passed over for the final cut. Instead, Roger Waters took full control over the visual presentation, using photographs taken by his then brother-in-law, Willie Christie. That decision mirrors the album itself, a clean break from the band's established identity, and another sign of how singular Waters' vision had become. A deluxe box set could expand beautifully on this imagery, the medals, the poppies, the stark military symbolism. A realistic package might include Disc 1, new all-analogue remaster from the original tapes, Disc 2, 5.1 and Atmos mixes, Disc 3, Wall era demos and early versions, Disc 4, the final cut film, restored in high definition, plus a replica When the Tigers Broke Free 7-inch single and a reproduction 12-inch vinyl repress of the album, all analogue of course, and a hardback book of lyrics, drafts, session notes and Christie's photography. And suddenly this becomes a genuinely important historical document. So, do we actually need a final cut box set? Well, if you're a casual listener, probably not. This isn't an album people play lightly. It's bleak, it's confrontational, it's emotionally exhausting. You don't really enjoy the final cut, you absorb it. But for collectors, audiophiles and those who see Pink Floyd as a continuous artistic journey, yes, absolutely. Because the final cut is the real end of Pink Floyd as a creative band. Everything after this is something else entirely. A box set wouldn't be revisionism, it would be context. So there's one final, slightly uncomfortable reality to consider. If Sony followed a usual industry pattern, the obvious milestone would be 2033, the 50th anniversary of the final cut. But waiting that long carries risks. Roger Waters is now in his 80s, and love him or loathe him, This album is inseparable from its creator. If Sony want a box set with real authority, with Waters' input, approval and perspective, there's a strong argument that it needs to happen sooner rather than later. Because if it's left too long, you risk ending with a technically impressive archive release that lacks the voice of the man who actually conceived it. And given how personal the final cut is, that would feel like a significant loss. So, what do you think? Should the final cut finally get the deluxe box set treatment I think it deserves? Or is it better left alone, stark and uncompromising, exactly as Roger Waters intended? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I always enjoy reading them. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe and tap the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers, bye-bye.